Norway, so I grew up in Norway. You know, so I was my last year in high school was when the wall fell down and the Cold War was over. So yeah, so I was in Norway.
Did Norway have like a particular reaction to that? Were they...
To the fall?
Yeah.
As the rest of the world, you know, we were celebrating and we were in awe, you know, of what was happening because nobody had foreseen it, nobody had predicted it, and it happened so very, very fast. So it was, we were, I suppose it was
bewilderment?
sort of, you know, happy but not really believing what was happening, right? It's because it was a reality that we had lived with for so long, and the idea that the world was just going to be totally different was very strange.
Okay. And how do you feel like did the atmosphere like shift after the fall? Did like what became dominant? I guess in like what perspectives were dominant in Norway at the time? Like those that views that possibly denounced communism, or in otherwise like in favor of capitalism.
I suppose I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I wasn't politically conscious enough at the time, but I can't recall there being. I recall there being discussions about whether or not this was really capitalism that had won or not. But you know, Norway, as much of Europe, is very much a mix of a free market economy, but a very strong state, right? So we have these social democratic systems where you have pretty strong socialist ideas in that the state takes care of, you know, welfare, education, health, and so on and so forth. So I sort of remember the debates being pretty balanced, you know, that it wasn't like a wild celebration of capitalism having won, you know, because most of us didn't see ourselves as capitalists anyway.
Liberal.
It was more, I think, the joy of these areas being liberated politically and that the borders were going to be open. Like, so my parents, they went the summer of 1990, they went camping in Eastern Germany and Poland, and up until today I regret that I didn't go with them, you know, but I, you know, as a 19-year-old, 18-year-old, I didn't really want to go vacationing with my parents, but it's, but it was that type of thing, you know, the borders were open, you could now freely move around, I can visit these places that had been closed off before.
As a youth, do you feel heavily influenced or partially influenced by basically everything surrounding the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall? Do you feel like this influenced you growing up, or your views on other people, particularly like those in Russia and like former Soviet states?
It has influenced my views on. I suppose I'm, you know, also being a history teacher, you know, having studied history, I suppose I'm very conscious of their experiences being very different than my own. I don't know if, I suppose I sort of still think of Eastern Europe as kind of lagging behind or being less developed, you know, economically, technologically than Western Europe, although that's, you know, not the case, at least not with all of the areas. And it's still, maybe, you know, the fact that so much of Eastern Europe is becoming part of the European Union, for example, is still kind of, I wouldn't say strange, but it's something that you can notice, right? You feel like, oh, you know, this is, I'm conscious of that being a new development, right? That Europe is kind of coming together, and that's a new thing. But I don't think that it has affected my relations with people from there. Yeah. Maybe I'm curious. I'm very curious to talk to people from there, and especially people with my age or older that lived through it and what their experiences were and what they miss about it and what they're happy about. You know, that's.
So you're like empathetic towards it.
Apathetic?
Empathetic.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah, but yeah, or curious about those different experiences, you know, and definitely, yeah, definitely, you would feel like, you know, their childhood, you know, was very different. Oh, it was quite different than mine. Not very different, maybe, but it was quite different. They had limitations that we didn't know. Right? So it's.
So, Shreya, where were you in the Cold War?
Where was I in the Cold War? Well, when I was, I grew up in Minnesota. So I was born in 1955. I lived there then from 1955 to 1977. I lived in Minnesota, and then from there I moved to Chicago. And then the last few years I was in Hong Kong.
So during your time in America, how was the atmosphere towards communism in general and the general propaganda that was used against it?
Propaganda? That's not, you mean there were lies?
Yeah,
No, it was obviously the Soviets were the bad guys. We hated them. They were trying to ruin our way of life. They hated democracy. They were godless, soulless communists. Everybody knew that they were. They wouldn't be happy unless our country was destroyed. So we needed to stop them wherever we could.
and when the purge of the communists happened, where the color red was taboo, were you present at the time when that happened? Were you like conscious of?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that happened in the 50s, but it was still, you know, present. They got over that a little bit, you know, the McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy stuff. But yeah, it was not to be called a communist was not a good thing. Although it changed a little bit in the 60s because there was a lot of war protests. And the Vietnam War, of course, was an extension of the Cold War. It was just the United States and the Soviet Union fighting in another place using surrogates. But people were against that, so they were started to go against the U.S. government because they were against the war, and then they became a little more pro-communist as a way to go. Particularly, you know, Mao's Little Red Book was a famous thing. A lot of when I was in university in the early 70s, that was a thing that people was sort of cachet to. Well, I'm reading that. You know.
When the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR was collapsing, where were you?
Then I was actually back in the United States.
And the reaction?
I didn't believe it. I didn't really buy it. I was anti the government, the Republican government, Ronald Reagan, and all his stuff. So anything that he said was good, I was pretty sure was bad. So which is a wrong thing to do. Anytime you take all one side over the other. Even Ronald Reagan wasn't wrong all the time, just most of the time. So I didn't really think it was going to happen. I didn't really believe it was all Soviet Union was gone. Everybody was going to be happy, and you know Brezhnev and those guys were going to give us a nice, happy. Yeah. And here we are back in it again. But that's they like that better anyway.
All right, thank you, sir, for the interview.
Is that all you need?
Yeah. When the Cold War was like active.
Well, I was born in 1963, which was about a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think Kennedy was assassinated about 3 or 4 months after I was born. So, I remember Vietnam. I remember the space race. I somewhat remember Afghanistan, minimally.
What about the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breaking of the USSR?
I had 2 daughters born, one in 1986, one in 1988, so they were, 3 and 1, so I was pretty busy.
But did you feel at the time you were alive in the U.S., did you feel the propaganda and the hate for communism?
Yes,
was it really
absolutely apparent?
It was?
Yes, absolutely.
The following is a series of emails received from Mr. Mastin, who has a first-hand account of the events being investigated.
Hello, Nasib. While attending the University of Copenhagen, Denmark in the fall of 1986, I took a history class focused on the Soviet Union. As part of our class, we traveled to Moscow and Leningrad in October of that year. I have about 9 days of stories of our travel and behind the scenes looks. I traded on the black market, went to a breakdance party outside the city limits of Moscow, and snuck into a grade school to listen to an English class and hand out pencils and candy. Thinking back, I believe the average Russian in Moscow knew the reality that there was something more to the story with the West. The interactions we had in passing or structured were met with enthusiasm towards America. It felt like a sports team rivalry at times. As an average American, I was able to travel there, but there was no way they could travel outside the communist bloc. Our commodities, both tangible or philosophical, were in high demand. They seemed to like a good discussion and blamed the governments, not the people. I left feeling like these people aren't so bad. At the same time, there seemed to be a slight over-the-shoulder sense of being watched. I didn't get the impression that they knew what freedom was, and because some of the things we did needed to be done in secret, there was a certain paranoia. I didn't see any direct propaganda towards the US or West, but more propaganda towards the great socialist revolution. There was a strong feeling of pride and perseverance that ran throughout the society. We saw plenty of older people wearing medals from World War II. Our trip there coincided with the 69th anniversary of the revolution. Being in East Germany seemed more dangerous. Perhaps it was because of the contrast between the west side and east side was so great. We heard the week before we got there that someone had been shot trying to get to the west side. The tension was much higher there. When we went to the east side, I remember being struck by a feeling of gray. It was fall, and there was little color anyway. But I don't remember people smiling, and the fashion was of a bygone era. The west side was alive, and like many other European cities at the time, both cities seemed 20 years behind the west in the way they operated and general feeling on the street. In Denmark, there was little to no regard for the Soviet Union or East Germany. The Danes were into being Danes. If anything, I remember talking about the Nazis with some of the older people. I never felt like the communist bloc intimidated or played into Danish culture. Being a more socialist country, Denmark embraced some of the teachings of Marx and definitely felt different than America. But there was a sense of freedom there that at times was larger than what I felt back home.
The following email is from Mr. Crouch, another interviewee of ours, with extensive knowledge on the topic at hand. The border in Berlin opened on November 9, 1989. Here are some impressions from before and after that date. My generation grew up with the threat of nuclear war, and Europe was one of the main battlefields. American nuclear missiles were stationed in Britain, and CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was very local. Look for articles on CND and Greenhand Common. The reality of a nuclear war was portrayed in the film Threads, which described in semi-documentary style the devastation after an attack on Sheffield in North England. It's very graphic. Take a look. I studied German at the university from 1987 to 1991. So before, during, and after the changes that swept through Europe, I studied for a summer in 1988 at the Humboldt University in East Berlin. Most of what we did was listen to propaganda, but we also saw how restrictive life was in the East. Poor food, no luxuries, and we had Bistro Socialist Party members, the party was the SED, who were our guides, and who put a positive spin on everything. A very surreal experience. Later we learned that they were Stasi operatives, spies. In 1989, I went to live in Germany for a year, working as a language assistant in a school. In the October of 1989, I went hiking in the Harz Mountains in Germany, which at the time were split down the middle by the German border. Looked for the village of Klostuel Zellerfield, walked through the forest for a while, and wrote in the diary that the border would never open. And then a month later, November 1989, remember that there was no internet, no mobile phones, and no social media. relied on the news on TV for information. Suddenly, and I should have seen it coming, I suppose, but I was 20 and had other things on my mind. We watched the news and there it was. The wall was open. My school principal did me a huge favor and gave me the day off. On November 14th, I went by train to Berlin. Even then, a very strange experience. At the German border, the East German border guards would come in train and check everyone's papers, in utter silence. Anyway, we got to Berlin and had the experience of walking along the border, sometimes on the eastern side, sometimes on the western side. Relations and attitudes. USA and the USSR, we were brought up with the idea that the other side of the Iron Curtain was pure evil. The communism was inhumane, etc. In reality, it wasn't communism that was bad, but what was done in its name. Think of Animal Farm. It all started out fine and then fell apart. The USA was the big brother for Britain, but there was resentment too. Remember, at the time, the UK influence was waning, just we hadn't realized it yet. The family that I stayed with in Hamburg had relations in the East. After the border opened, the relatives visited. My host family made a big show of giving them the best of everything, as if to prove that we in the West had everything. It seemed rather arrogant to me. Thanks for watching. Credits go out to Elise Saud, Joseph Faye, James C. Lurch, Marvin Maston, Stuart Crouch. This video was done by Nasib Ghannam, Habib Kassasir, Salah Khazal, and Karim Hamdi.